The countdown began before I even understood what I was hearing. 72 hours. That was the number the translator fed into my ear, cold and flat, as if it were reading out a weather report instead of a death sentence for every living person on Earth. I was sitting in the third row of the human delegation platform, my hands pressed flat against my knees to stop them from shaking, when Emperor Vaslor Cthulhu raised one long silver hand and the entire chamber went silent. I am Daniel Hartley. I was not a soldier. I was not a general, or a president, or anyone important enough to be remembered by history. I was a linguist, assigned to the first contact team because I could learn a new grammar faster than anyone else they tested. Nobody expected me to matter. Nobody expected any of us sitting on that platform to matter, not really. We were there to listen, to translate, to carry messages back to a planet that had no idea how close it was standing to the edge of a cliff. The chamber itself was built from a material that looked like poured light, curved walls that pulsed faintly with a slow, breathing rhythm, as if the whole structure were alive. Above us, rings of alien officials sat in silence, their eyes, some of them yellow, some of them a deep, unreadable black, all fixed on the small stage where the six of us sat. We were the entire human presence, in a room built to hold 10,000. The Emperor did not shout. He did not need to. His voice, translated into my ear a half-second after he spoke, was almost gentle, and that gentleness was somehow worse than any anger could have been. He said that his court had reviewed our species for 11 of what he called cycles, a unit of time I still did not fully understand, something close to a year, but not quite. He said they had studied our wars, our weapons, the way we had split our own world into thousands of competing nations, the way we had built machines capable of ending our own species twice over before we had even left our own solar system in any meaningful way. He said humanity displayed what his advisors called uncontained aggression, a pattern his empire had seen only a handful of times before, and every single time, he said, it had ended the same way. I remember trying to raise my hand, trying to say something, anything, about the wars we had also stopped, about the treaties, about the fact that we had reached out into the dark and tried to speak rather than simply take. But the Emperor was not asking for a response. He was not asking for anything at all. He was informing us. Beside me, Ambassador Louise Bennett rose to her feet, her voice steady in a way I could never have managed. She asked, through the translator, for time. She asked for a chance to present evidence, for a formal hearing, for anything that resembled a process rather than a verdict already carved in stone. The Emperor listened to her, the way a parent listens to a child asking to stay up past bedtime, patient, almost fond, and completely unmoved. He told her that mercy for a contagion was not mercy at all. He told her that the galaxy had learned, at great cost, that species like ours did not change, they only grew stronger, and then more dangerous, until the cost of stopping them became too high to pay. Better, he said, to end the sickness while it was still small enough to end cleanly. Then he lifted his hand a second time, and a new light appeared above the chamber floor, a slow spinning number, the kind that needed no translation at all, because every species in that room understood exactly what it meant. 72 hours, and then Earth would stop existing. I want to tell you that the room erupted into chaos, that guards rushed forward, that alarms sounded through the corridors. None of that happened. What happened was worse. The chamber simply returned to its quiet, breathing hum, as though nothing unusual had occurred at all, as though a death sentence for 8 billion people was simply another line item in a very long meeting. Officials began speaking among themselves in low tones. Some glanced at us with something that might have been pity. Most did not look at us at all. I turned to Louise, and I saw that even she, who had negotiated trade routes and border disputes for 20 years before this assignment, did not know what to say. Beside her, Colonel Owen Marsh sat with his jaw locked so tight I could see the muscle working beneath his skin. None of us moved. None of us spoke. We simply sat there, 6 humans on a stage built for a species that had already decided we did not deserve to exist, watching a number count down above our heads. I do not know how long we sat in that silence. It felt like hours. It was probably closer to 20 minutes. The Emperor had already begun to turn away, already begun to gesture towards some new matter of business, some other unfortunate species waiting somewhere else in his endless schedule of judgments, when every screen in the chamber went dark at once. I want to be precise about what I saw, because I have told this story enough times now that I know how easy it is to let the memory grow larger than the truth. The screens did not flicker, they did not stutter or glitch the way a broken signal might. They simply went black, all of them, at exactly the same moment, as though someone somewhere had reached out and turned off every light in the room with a single motion. For a moment, nothing happened. The alien officials around us murmured, confused, some rising slightly from their seats. I heard a low mechanical groan from somewhere deep in the walls, a sound I had never heard the chamber make before. Even the Emperor paused, his hand still half raised in the air, his head tilting slightly, the closest thing to surprise I had seen from him since we arrived. Then the screens came back. Every single one of them, in that vast chamber built to hold 10,000 beings from a dozen different worlds, showed the exact same image. A human face. I did not recognize her at first, not in that first frozen second, because my mind simply could not process what I was looking at. It made no sense. There was no reason for a human face to appear on alien screens in the heart of an alien capital, broadcast simultaneously across every surface in a room where humanity had just been sentenced to die. She looked young, maybe 30, with light brown hair pulled back loosely, standing in front of what looked like an ordinary kitchen window, sunlight falling across her shoulders. She was not shouting, she was not pleading, she simply stood there, looking directly into whatever camera had captured her, with an expression I can only describe as calm. Around me, the alien chamber, which moments before had been ready to move on to other business, as though nothing important had happened at all, had gone completely, utterly silent. I turned to Louise. Her face had gone pale, her mouth slightly open. I turned to Owen, and he was staring at the nearest screen with an expression I had never seen on him before, something between recognition and disbelief. I looked back at the screen, at her face, calm and steady, above a room full of beings who had just decided, without a single doubt in their minds, that my species did not deserve to see another sunrise. And somewhere behind me, I heard the Emperor speak a single word into the silence, a word the translator did not know how to interpret, a word that came out not as language, but as raw, uncertain sound. I did not know it yet, but that single frozen image, one ordinary woman standing in an ordinary kitchen, was about to unravel everything the Emperor's court believed they understood about us. For nearly a full minute, nobody in that chamber moved. I have negotiated tense meetings before, rooms where anger sat thick in the air like smoke, but I had never felt anything like the silence that followed the appearance of that face. It was not the silence of calm. It was the silence of 1,000 beings trying to understand something that refused to be understood. The woman on the screen did not speak. She did not move. She simply stood there, in that quiet kitchen with sunlight falling across her shoulders, looking out at us, or at something beyond us, with an expression that held no fear at all. I leaned toward Louise and whispered that I did not recognize the room behind her, that I could not place the woman, that I had no idea how this was even possible. Louise did not answer me. Her eyes were fixed on the screen, and for the first time since I had met her, I saw something close to fear cross her face, though I could tell it was not fear of the image itself. It was fear of not understanding what the image meant. Around us, the alien officials had begun speaking rapidly among themselves, their voices overlapping in a dozen different tongues, most of which my translator struggled to keep pace with. I caught fragments, words like breach and impossible and containment failure. I caught the word signal repeated over and over, always followed by a question mark I could hear even through the flat tone of translated speech. A tall official, near the front of the chamber, dressed in robes the color of deep water, rose from his seat and turned toward a cluster of technicians standing near the base of the platform. I watched his mouth move, sharp and urgent, and a moment later, 3 of the technicians broke away and ran, toward a doorway at the side of the chamber, their long limbs moving in a way that looked almost desperate. I turned to Owen and asked him, quietly, if he had any idea what was happening. He shook his head slowly, his eyes still fixed on the frozen image above us. He said the only thing he could think to say, which was that whatever this was, it was not coming from us, not from Earth, not from our ship, not from anything we controlled. We had no broadcast equipment capable of reaching a single alien vessel, let alone the entire capital of an empire that spanned more star systems than any of us could properly imagine. I remember looking up at the Emperor, expecting to see the same calm certainty he had worn only minutes before, when he delivered his verdict as easily as reading a weather report. Instead, I saw him standing very still, his long silver hand still raised, frozen in the exact position it had held when the screens went dark. His eyes, when the light from the frozen image reflected in them, looked less like the eyes of an absolute ruler and more like the eyes of someone who had just been told a story he did not want to believe. One of his advisors approached him, bowing low, speaking in a hushed and rapid tone. I could not fully translate what was said, but I caught enough to understand the shape of it. The advisor was telling the Emperor that this signal had not come through any known channel. It was not a transmission intercepted from outside. It was not a message relayed through any of the Empire's monitoring stations. It had simply appeared, all at once, on every screen in the capital, as though it had been there all along, waiting. I felt a cold weight settle in my chest at those words. If this broadcast had not come from any external source, if it had not traveled through space at all, then where had it come from? I did not have an answer, and judging by the panic spreading through the officials around us, neither did they. The Emperor lowered his hand slowly. He turned toward the platform where the 6 of us sat, and for the first time since our arrival, he looked directly at me, not as a representative of a species awaiting judgment, but as though he were searching my face for answers I did not have. He asked, through the translator, if this was some kind of human weapon. He asked if we had found a way to breach his empire's most secure systems, to reach every screen in his capital at once, as a final act of defiance before our destruction. His voice had lost its earlier calm. There was an edge in it now, something sharp and uncertain, and for the first time I understood that the being who had just condemned my entire species to death was, in this moment, genuinely afraid. Louise stood, and I admired her in that moment more than I ever had before, because her voice did not shake even slightly as she answered him. She said that Earth possessed no technology capable of what he was describing. She said humanity had barely begun to understand the alien communication networks we had encountered, let alone find a way to override them entirely. She said, plainly, that whatever this was, it was not our doing, and that we were just as confused as anyone else in that chamber. The Emperor studied her for a long moment, and then his gaze shifted back to the frozen image above us, to the woman standing quietly in her kitchen, patient as still water. It was then that the image finally moved. She blinked, slowly, deliberately, as though she had all the time in the world. And then she began to speak. Her voice, when it reached us, was not loud. It did not carry the weight of command or the sharp edge of a threat. It was simply a voice, quiet and steady, the kind of voice you might hear from someone reading a bedtime story or explaining something patiently to a frightened child. She said that she knew what had just been decided in that room. She said she understood the countdown that now hung above our heads, though she did not explain how she knew any of it. She said she was not here to beg for mercy, and she was not here to threaten anyone. Then she said something that made the chamber, already silent, fall into an even deeper stillness. She said she was speaking not for herself, and not even entirely for Earth as it stood in that moment, but for something older than any single lifetime, older than any single nation or war or treaty humanity had ever written. She said she was speaking for a pattern, one the emperor's own advisors would recognize if they looked closely enough at their own history, buried somewhere in the archives of worlds his empire had judged before and destroyed too quickly to ever understand. I felt my pulse quicken as I listened, because I realized, sitting there on that stage, that I had absolutely no idea who this woman was. I had spent months studying the human delegation roster, memorizing every name and face that might be called upon to speak on Earth's behalf. She was not on any list I had ever seen. She held no title, wore no uniform, represented no government or agency that I could identify from her plain kitchen and her plain clothing. And yet every screen in an empire that spanned the stars had chosen her, and only her, to speak. The tall official in the water-colored robes turned to the emperor and said something urgent, his voice rising in pitch in a way that even the flat tone of translation could not fully soften. I caught enough of it to piece together his meaning. He was telling the emperor that his analysts had found something in the deep archive records, something about a signal pattern that matched no known origin but bore certain characteristics his people had documented once before, centuries ago, on another judged world, shortly before that world's destruction had gone catastrophically wrong. The emperor's expression shifted at those words in a way I will never forget. The calm certainty that had defined him since the moment he entered the chamber cracked, just slightly, just enough for me to see something underneath it. Not weakness exactly, something closer to memory, something closer to old, buried fear. He asked the official, quietly this time, what exactly he meant by catastrophically wrong. The official did not answer immediately. He glanced toward us, toward the small human delegation sitting frozen on our stage, and then back at his emperor, and I understood, even without a full translation, that whatever answer he was about to give was not one he wanted to speak aloud in front of the very species it concerned. Above us, the woman on the screen continued speaking, calm and unhurried, as though she had all the time left in the universe, even as the countdown clock beside her steadily, silently, continued to fall. She said one more thing before the screens finally dimmed, not to black this time, but to a soft, steady glow that remained even after her image faded. She said that before the emperor made his final decision, he owed it to himself, and to every species watching through those screens, to understand exactly what kind of pattern he was truly looking at. Then her voice was gone, and the chamber was left holding a silence heavier than anything I had felt since we first walked through those tall, breathing doors. I looked over at Louise. I looked at Owen. None of us spoke, because none of us yet understood what we had just witnessed, or how deeply it was about to change everything that happened next. But I remember thinking, in that strange and terrible quiet, that whoever this woman was, she had just done something no human delegation, no ambassador, no general, and no president had managed to do in the entire history of our contact with this empire. She had made the emperor of an empire that spanned the stars pause for the very first time and ask himself if he might be wrong. It took nearly an hour before I finally understood who she was, and when the memory surfaced, it hit me with a force that nearly knocked the breath out of my chest. Her name was Grace Whitfield. I had not seen her in almost 15 years, not since I was a teenager living 3 houses down from her family in a small town most people had never heard of, the kind of place with one main street, one grocery store, and a river that flooded every few years no matter how many times the town tried to build higher walls against it. Grace was older than me by 6 or 7 years, old enough that I had mostly known her as the quiet young woman who lived down the street, the one who always seemed to be helping someone, though never in a way that drew attention to herself. I remembered the year the river rose higher than anyone had planned for, swallowing half the town in a single terrible night. I remembered how the emergency services were stretched too thin, how half the roads were underwater before help could even arrive. And I remembered Grace, barely into her 20s at the time, wading through water up to her waist to help pull an elderly neighbor out of a flooded home, then turning right back around to do it again for another family 2 streets over, and then again and again, long after any reasonable person would have stopped to rest. She was not a soldier. She was not a scientist or an engineer or anyone with special training that prepared her for a disaster like that. She simply refused to stop helping, hour after hour, until the sun came up and the water finally began to recede. I had not thought about that night in years. I certainly never expected to see her face projected onto every screen in an alien capital, standing calmly at the center of a moment that would decide whether my entire species lived or died. Sitting there on that stage, trying to steady my own breathing, I began to understand something the alien court clearly had not, something I do not think they could have understood, not with the way they had built their judgment of us. The Emperor's court had studied our wars. They had studied our weapons, our conflicts, the long and painful history of humanity turning against itself again and again across thousands of years. And in a strange way, I could not blame them for what they saw, because that history is real, and it is not something I would ever try to hide or excuse. But that was never the whole picture, and it never could be, because a species is not only the worst knights in its history, it is also every ordinary person who wades into rising water for a neighbor they barely know. It is every stranger who stops on the side of a road to help someone they will never see again. It is the quiet, unremarkable decision, repeated by millions of ordinary people every single day, to help rather than to walk away. I turned to Louise and told her what I remembered, my voice barely above a whisper. I told her that the woman on the screen was someone I had actually known, once, a long time ago, in a town so small it barely appeared on any map. I told her what Grace had done during that flood, and I watched Louise's expression shift from confusion to something closer to wonder. Owen leaned in close and asked the question that mattered most. He asked how a woman like that, from a town like that, with no political power and no connection to any government or agency, could possibly end up broadcast across an entire alien empire at the exact moment our fate was being decided. I did not have an answer. Not then. But the water-robed official standing near the base of the Emperor's platform seemed to have one, and it was clear from his posture, stiff and reluctant, that it was not an answer he wanted to give. The Emperor turned to him directly and asked him to explain what his analysts had found in the archive. The official hesitated for a long moment before finally speaking, and as the translator carried his words to me, I felt the weight of what he was describing settle over the entire chamber like a physical thing. He said that centuries before any of us in that room had been born, his empire had judged another species in almost exactly the same way they had judged Earth. That species, he said, had also displayed a long history of internal conflict, of wars fought against themselves before they ever reached the stars. The Empire's analysts of that era had reached the same conclusion the Emperor had reached today, that the species was too dangerous to be allowed to continue, and a similar countdown had been set. And then, he said, in the final hours before that countdown reached 0, every screen across the Empire's capital had shown the same thing we were seeing now. Not a warning, not a threat, simply an ordinary member of that judged species, standing quietly, doing nothing more dramatic than existing in front of whatever had chosen to broadcast them. The Emperor of that era, the official said, had dismissed the image the same way many in this room had wanted to dismiss Grace only an hour ago. He had called it a trick, a distraction, an act of desperation from a dying species with nothing left to lose. And he had allowed the countdown to finish exactly as planned. I felt my chest tighten as I waited for what came next, because I could see, even before the official finished speaking, that whatever had happened afterward had left a mark on this empire deep enough to still be feared centuries later. The official said that within a single generation of that world's destruction, something the archives only referred to as the unraveling had begun. species who had once been loyal subjects of the empire, worlds that had never before questioned the emperor's authority, began, quietly at first, and then openly, to resist. Not through war, not through weapons, but through a slow and steady refusal to cooperate, a spreading loss of faith in the empire's right to judge and destroy entire worlds on its own terms. The archives, he said, called it a contagion of doubt, and it had taken the empire nearly 2 full centuries to fully recover the loyalty it lost in the years following that single, hasty destruction. Some border territories, he admitted quietly, had never fully returned to the empire's control at all. I looked up at the emperor as this was explained, and I saw something in his expression that had not been there before. Not fear exactly, but a deep and careful caution, the look of a ruler who suddenly understood that the decision in front of him was far heavier than he had first believed. He asked the official, his voice quiet, whether the pattern always appeared before a species was destroyed, or only sometimes. The official admitted that his analysts were still uncertain. In most cases, he said, no image appeared at all, and judged species simply ended, quietly and completely, without any disturbance to the wider empire. But in the rare cases where the image did appear, he said, every single time, without exception, the destruction that followed had caused lasting damage far beyond the single world that had been destroyed. I understood, sitting there listening to this explanation, that the empire did not fear Grace because of anything she had done. They feared her because of what her sudden, unexplained appearance seemed to represent. A signal, ancient and mysterious, that something about the species now being judged carried consequences far beyond its own borders. I thought about that flood again, about Grace wading through cold water to help people she barely knew, expecting nothing in return, not recognition, not reward, simply doing what needed to be done because someone needed help and she was there to give it. I thought about how easy it would have been for the emperor's analysts to miss a moment like that entirely, buried as it was in the ordinary, unremarkable texture of a single human life in a single small town. And I began to understand, more clearly than I ever had before, exactly what kind of pattern this empire was truly afraid of. It was not a weapon, it was not a hidden fleet, or a secret technology capable of striking back. It was something far harder to measure and far harder to destroy completely, a quiet, stubborn thread of decency that ran through humanity even in its worst and most desperate moments, one that had somehow, impossibly, reached across the stars to make itself known at exactly the right time. Louise turned to me and asked quietly whether I thought this had been planned, whether some part of Earth's government or military had somehow arranged all of this without telling the rest of the delegation. I told her honestly that I did not believe so. Nothing about our technology, our resources, or our understanding of alien systems could explain what we had just witnessed. If this had been engineered, it had not been engineered by us, not in any way I understood. Owen suggested, quietly, that perhaps it did not need to be engineered at all. Perhaps, he said, it was simply true, the way a fact is true whether or not anyone ever bothers to measure it. Perhaps somewhere in the deep architecture of the universe, a pattern this old and this consistent had simply built itself over centuries of repetition, judged species after judged species, until it had become something close to a law, waiting quietly for the right moment to reveal itself again. I did not know if he was right. I still do not know, even now, telling this story long after the fact. But I remember, in that moment, feeling something shift inside the chamber itself, a change in the air that had nothing to do with temperature or sound. The Emperor turned back toward us, toward the small human delegation seated on a stage far too large for 6 people, and for the first time since the verdict had been announced, I saw something in his expression that looked almost like uncertainty. He asked us directly, his voice quieter than I had heard it before, if we knew this woman. I rose to my feet before Louise or Owen could stop me, my legs trembling slightly beneath me, and I answered him honestly. I told him that yes, I knew her, once, a long time ago, in a town so small and so ordinary that nothing about it had ever seemed remarkable to me until this very moment. I told him what she had done during that flood, how she had helped strangers again and again, with no expectation of anything in return, simply because it was the right thing to do. I told him that if his empire was searching for some hidden weapon behind her appearance, some secret plan or clever trick, he would not find one, because there was nothing to find. There was only an ordinary woman, doing an ordinary, quietly extraordinary thing, the same way countless humans had done throughout our long and difficult history, buried beneath the wars and conflicts his analysts had studied so carefully. The chamber remained silent as I spoke, and when I finally sat back down, I realized that every alien eye in that vast room, and the Emperor's most of all, was fixed directly on me. I did not yet know it, but in speaking those words, I had just stepped, without meaning to, into the exact center of the storm that was about to decide everything. The Emperor did not respond right away. He simply stood there, studying me the way a person studies a puzzle they had believed was already solved, only to discover a piece that no longer fit. Behind him, the water-robed official shifted uneasily, glancing between his ruler and the frozen glow still lingering on every screen in the chamber, as though he expected it to change again at any moment. I remained standing, because sitting down suddenly felt like giving up ground I had not meant to claim. My heart was pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my throat, but I forced myself to keep my voice steady when the Emperor finally spoke again. He asked me a question I had not expected. He asked whether humanity understood what we were being accused of, or whether we simply assumed his judgment was cruelty without cause. I answered carefully, choosing each word the way I had been trained to choose words in every negotiation I had ever studied. I told him that we understood the accusation completely. I told him that our history was full of wars, full of moments where we had turned on each other with a ferocity that still shamed us when we looked back on it honestly. I told him I would not stand there and pretend that history away, because pretending would only prove his point, that we could not be trusted to see ourselves clearly. But I told him, too, that a single chapter of a long book is never the whole story, and that judging an entire species by its worst moments, without weighing the moments that came after, when we learned, when we changed, when we chose differently, was not justice. It was only fear wearing the mask of justice. A murmur rippled through the chamber at that, and I noticed several of the officials seated in the upper rings leaning forward, their attention no longer fixed only on the Emperor, but now, uncomfortably, on me. The tall official in the water-colored robes stepped forward and addressed the Emperor directly, his voice sharp with an urgency that cut through the quiet murmuring around us. He said that regardless of the human's words, the pattern itself could not be ignored. He reminded the Emperor of the unraveling that had followed the last judged world's destruction, the slow spreading loss of loyalty among subject species that had taken 2 centuries to fully repair. He said that several of the Empire's oldest allied worlds, watching this exact broadcast in this exact moment, were already reacting. He gestured toward a bank of smaller screens along the side wall of the chamber, screens I had not paid close attention to until now, each one displaying a different alien world's council chamber or gathering hall. On several of them, I could see beings of different shapes and sizes standing, some gesturing angrily among themselves, others simply staring, frozen, at whatever version of Grace's broadcast had reached their own screens. The official explained, his voice tight with something close to genuine worry, that reports were already arriving from 3 separate allied systems, each describing the same reaction: confusion, followed by unrest, followed by open questioning of the Empire's right to make this kind of judgment alone, without consultation, without appeal. I realized, listening to him, that the very thing the Empire feared most, the erosion of its authority among the many species it had conquered and absorbed over centuries, was already beginning, not because of anything we had done, but simply because the pattern had appeared, and every species watching understood exactly what that pattern had meant the last time it appeared. The Emperor's expression darkened, though I could see now that the darkness was not entirely anger. There was something else beneath it, a kind of exhausted recognition, as though he had hoped, against experience, that this time might be different. He turned to the water-robed official and asked him directly what he recommended. The official hesitated, glancing briefly at me before answering, and I understood in that pause that whatever he was about to suggest was not something he wanted to say in front of the species it concerned. He recommended delay, not mercy, he was careful to clarify, not forgiveness, simply delay, enough time to allow the unrest among the allied systems to settle, enough time to determine whether the pattern was, in fact, a genuine warning or simply an unfortunate coincidence that happened to resemble one. Another official, seated in the upper rings, rose to object. This one wore no robes at all, only a smooth, dark covering across a body built low and wide, and his voice, when translated, carried none of the careful diplomacy of the first official's tone. He argued that delay was exactly the kind of weakness that had allowed humanity's supposed contagion to spread in the first place. He argued that the longer the Empire waited, the more time humanity would have to prepare some kind of countermove, some hidden defense we had not yet revealed. I wanted desperately to interrupt him, to explain again that we had no hidden defense, no secret fleet waiting somewhere beyond the edge of the system, nothing at all beyond 6 frightened people sitting on a stage far from home. But I forced myself to stay silent, because I understood, even in that moment, that this argument was no longer only about us. It had become a fight within the Empire itself, between those who feared repeating an old mistake and those who feared appearing weak in front of their own subjects. The Emperor raised his hand for silence, and the chamber obeyed instantly, the way a room full of beings obeys a ruler they have feared for far longer than any of us had been alive. He turned back to me, and this time his question was different. He asked me, directly, what I believed would happen if he chose to proceed with the destruction exactly as planned, ignoring the pattern entirely. I thought carefully before I answered, because I understood that whatever I said next might matter more than anything I had said in my entire life. I told him that I could not predict what his own empire would do, that this was not my history to know, but I told him that if the pattern he feared was real, if it had appeared before every time a judged species turned out to hold consequences far beyond its own destruction, then destroying us now, in front of every allied world already watching this exact moment unfold, would not prove humanity dangerous. It would prove the Empire itself was exactly the kind of ruler its own subjects were beginning to fear. The chamber fell silent again, deeper this time, and I could see the water-robed official's shoulders relax slightly, though he was careful not to let it show on his face. The countdown clock, still spinning quietly above us, had fallen past the 60-hour mark while we spoke, a fact that had not escaped my attention even in the middle of everything else happening around us. I found myself glancing at it more than once, unable to stop the cold weight it placed in my chest every time the numbers shifted lower. Louise rose beside me and added her own voice to mine, calm and measured, the voice of someone who had spent decades learning how to speak to powerful people without ever raising her tone. She reminded the Emperor that a decision made in haste, under fear, was rarely a decision anyone respected afterward, least of all the one who made it. She reminded him that his own advisors had already shown him what haste had cost the Empire once before. The dark, low-bodied official rose again to argue, his voice rising with frustration, but this time fewer voices in the chamber rose to support him. I watched the mood shift slowly around the room, official by official, as more and more of them glanced toward the side screens still showing unrest spreading across allied worlds, and I understood that something delicate and important was happening, something none of us on that stage had the power to control directly. The Emperor stood in silence for a long moment, longer than any silence he had allowed since the moment we first entered the chamber. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost the flat, absolute certainty it carried at the beginning of this long and terrible day. He said he would not reverse his judgment lightly, and he would not be seen by his own court as a ruler who could be frightened into mercy by a single image on a screen. But he said, slowly, carefully, that a ruler who ignored centuries of costly experience simply to avoid the appearance of hesitation was not strength either. It was pride wearing the mask of strength, and pride, he admitted quietly, had cost his empire dearly before. He turned to the water-robed official and instructed him to gather the full council, every representative of every allied world currently watching this broadcast, for an emergency session before the countdown reached its final hour. I felt something loosen slightly in my chest at those words, though I understood immediately that this was not a victory. Not yet. It was only a door, cracked open just slightly, and I had no idea whether what waited on the other side would save us or simply delay the same outcome by a matter of hours. As the chamber began to shift into motion around us, officials rising, aides rushing toward doorways, the low murmur of urgent conversation rising once more, I looked up at the frozen glow still lingering where Grace's image had last appeared, though her face itself had long since faded from the screens. I did not know, in that moment, whether the pattern the Empire feared was some strange and ancient truth built into the fabric of the universe, or simply a story they had told themselves so many times that it had become powerful enough to shape their own decisions. I did not know if Grace herself was even aware of what had happened, wherever she was, back on a small and ordinary street, on a small and ordinary world that had no idea how close it had just come to disappearing entirely. But I knew that the countdown was still falling, that 59 hours remained above our heads, and that whatever happened next would be decided not by weapons or fleets or clever arguments, but by whether an empire built on centuries of unquestioned judgment could finally admit, in front of every world it ruled, that it might have been wrong. The council did not gather quickly. In an empire spanning more star systems than I could properly count, even an emergency session took time. Ships needed to align their signals. Representatives needed to be pulled from wherever they had been standing when the broadcast first appeared, and every hour that passed while we waited felt heavier than the one before it. We were moved from the great chamber to a smaller room nearby, plain by comparison, with soft walls the color of pale stone and a single long window that looked out over the alien capital itself. I remember standing at that window for a long time, watching towers, taller than anything Earth had ever built, stretch upward into a sky the color of dull copper, and thinking how strange it was that a place so far from home could hold the entire fate of everyone I had ever loved in its hands. Louise sat quietly at a long table, reviewing notes she had scrawled onto a small translation device, preparing arguments for a council she did not yet know how to predict. Owen paced near the door, his hands clasped behind his back, the way I imagined he must have paced during every difficult mission in his career before this one. The other 3 members of our delegation spoke quietly among themselves, running through scenarios, trying to guess which arguments might carry the most weight when the council finally convened. I found that I could not focus on any of it. My mind kept returning to Grace, to the calm and steady way she had spoken, as though she had known exactly what she was doing, though I still could not explain how any of it had been possible in the first place. It was nearly 6 hours later, the countdown having slipped below the 53-hour mark, when we were finally called back into the great chamber. This time, the space felt different. Every ring of seating was filled, representatives from dozens of allied worlds, now present in person or through tall, shimmering projections that stood in for those who could not arrive in time. The air itself seemed to hum with a tension I had not felt even during the original verdict, and I understood, walking back onto that small human stage, that whatever happened in the next few hours would be watched and remembered across the entire empire, long after this day had passed. The Emperor entered last, taking his place at the center of the chamber, his expression unreadable in a way that made my stomach tighten with uncertainty. The water-robed official stood beside him, and I noticed, with some relief, that the dark, low-bodied official who had argued so forcefully for haste now sat quietly among the crowd, his earlier confidence noticeably absent from his posture. The emperor began by addressing the full council directly, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber without any need for him to raise it. He described, plainly and without embellishment, everything that had happened since his original verdict: the broadcast, the pattern uncovered in the archives, the unrest already stirring among several allied systems. He did not attempt to minimize any of it, and I found myself surprised by his honesty, given how easily he could have shaped the story to protect his own authority instead. Then he did something I had not expected at all. He turned toward me and asked me to speak again, this time not only to him, but to the full assembled council of the Empire. I rose slowly, aware of every eye now fixed on me, human and alien alike, aware that whatever I said in the next few minutes would be heard by beings from more worlds than I could name. I told them the truth, as simply and honestly as I knew how to tell it. I told them that humanity was not a perfect species, that our history held wars and cruelty we were not proud of, mistakes we still carried the weight of even now. I told them that if they searched only for our worst moments, they would always find plenty of evidence to justify fear. But I told them, too, about the flood, about grace wading through freezing water again and again for people she barely knew, expecting nothing in return. I told them that this was not some rare and special exception in human behavior, but something that happened quietly, constantly, all across our world, in ways too small and too ordinary to ever make it into the history books their analysts had studied. I told them that judging a species only by its wars, while ignoring every quiet act of decency that held its people together in between those wars, was like judging an entire ocean by a single storm, while ignoring the calm, patient tide that shaped its shores every single day. I told them that if their empire truly wanted to avoid repeating the unraveling that had cost them 2 centuries of lost loyalty once before, the answer was not to act faster out of fear. It was to finally, honestly, look at the whole picture of a species before deciding its fate, rather than only the parts that were easiest to be afraid of. When I finished speaking, the chamber remained silent for a long moment, and I lowered myself back into my seat, my legs trembling with the effort of holding steady through every word. The council did not reach a decision quickly. Representative after representative rose to speak, some echoing the fear that had shaped the emperor's original verdict, others, increasingly, echoing the caution his advisors had raised about the pattern and its history. I listened to arguments in languages my translator struggled to keep pace with, watched projections flicker and shift as beings from a dozen different worlds debated the fate of a species most of them had never even heard of before this single, extraordinary day. Through it all, the countdown continued to fall, and I found myself watching it more than I watched the debate itself, unable to fully believe that a number so small, so simple, held the weight of everything and everyone I had ever known. It was nearing the final hour, the numbers above us dropping into single digits, when the water-robed official finally rose to deliver the council's decision. He announced, in a voice that carried clearly through the now hushed chamber, that the council had voted to suspend the original verdict, not permanently, he was careful to clarify, but pending a full and proper review, one that would take the whole of human history into account, rather than only its conflicts. He announced that the countdown would be halted immediately, and that a formal delegation would be established to conduct this review over the following months, with human representatives given a genuine voice in the process for the first time since our species had first made contact with this empire. I do not think I truly believed it until I looked up and saw the number above us freeze in place, hanging there, unmoving, exactly as it had been for one final, suspended moment before slowly fading from the screens entirely. The chamber erupted into a wave of overlapping conversation, some relieved, some clearly still frustrated by the outcome, but none of it mattered to me in that moment, beyond the simple, overwhelming fact that Earth was still going to exist when I woke up tomorrow. Louise gripped my arm tightly, her composure finally breaking just slightly, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, though she did not let them fall. Owen exhaled a long breath beside me, the kind of breath a person only releases when they have been holding it, without realizing it, for far longer than they should have. I want to tell you that the Emperor approached us afterward, that he apologized, that some grand and satisfying reconciliation took place between our two species in that chamber. That is not quite what happened. He did approach the stage, briefly, before the council fully dispersed, and he looked at me for a long moment with an expression I still find difficult to fully describe, something between respect and wariness, the look of a ruler who had been forced, publicly, to reconsider something he had believed with absolute certainty only hours before. He told me, quietly, that his empire did not often admit mistakes, and that this day would not soon be forgotten by his court, for better or worse. He did not promise us safety. He did not promise that the review ahead of us would end favorably. He only said that we had, at the very least, earned the right to be properly seen, rather than simply judged from a distance. It was not forgiveness. It was not even friendship. But it was something we had never truly had before in our short and uncertain history among the stars. A seat at the table, however small, however fragile, in a conversation that would decide not just our fate, but perhaps the fate of how this empire chose to judge every species it encountered from that day forward. I never learned exactly how Grace's image had reached those screens. Not truly. In the months that followed, as the review process slowly unfolded, alien scientists and human researchers alike studied the event from every possible angle, searching for some hidden signal, some overlooked technology, some rational explanation that would finally make sense of what we had witnessed. None of them ever found one. The broadcast remained, to this day, one of the Empire's oldest and least understood mysteries, a pattern that appeared exactly when it needed to, and vanished the moment its purpose had been served. I did eventually return home, back to Earth, back to the small, ordinary streets where all of this had somehow begun. I found Grace still living in that same small town, older now, quieter, entirely unaware, until I told her myself that her face had once appeared on every screen across an empire that spanned the stars, at the exact moment our species stood closest to its own ending. She did not seem surprised by the story so much as puzzled by it, the way anyone might be puzzled to learn that an ordinary afternoon they barely remembered had somehow, impossibly, mattered far more than they ever could have known. She asked me, quietly, whether she had done anything differently that day, anything at all, and I told her honestly that she had not. She had simply been exactly who she always was, and somehow that had been enough. I think about that conversation often, more than almost anything else from that entire impossible day. Because in the end, that was the truth the Emperor's court had missed, buried underneath centuries of studying our wars and our weapons and our worst moments. It was never some hidden strength or secret weapon that saved us. It was simply the quiet, unremarkable decency that so many of us carry without ever realizing its weight, until the day it is finally, unexpectedly, called upon to matter. The review process continues, even now, slower than any of us would like, complicated by politics and fear and the long, difficult work of trying to fully understand a species as complicated as our own. I do not know exactly how it will end. I do not know if the Empire will ever fully accept us, or if some new fear will rise one day to threaten us all over again. But I know this much. Sitting here now, far removed from that chamber and that countdown clock, though never quite free of the memory of watching it fall. The number reached 0 that day, in a sense, though not in the way anyone in that room expected. It reached 0 the moment an entire empire was forced to stop, to look closer, and to ask itself, for the very first time, in longer than any of them could remember, whether the story they had told themselves about a species was actually the whole story at all. I do not believe that Countdown truly disappeared, not completely. I believe it simply moved somewhere else, quieter now, resting patiently in the space between every judgment still left to be made, waiting for the next moment, someone, somewhere, decides that fear is easier to trust than understanding. But for one single, extraordinary day, an ordinary woman standing quietly in her kitchen proved that the opposite could also be true. And for that, I will never stop being grateful.